springtime, from May to December, but the days grow short when you reach September. The autumn weather turns the leaves to flame. One hasn't got time for the waiting game. Oh, the days dwindle down to a precious few. September, November, and these few precious days I'll spend with you. These precious days I'll spend with you. Oh, the days dwindle down to a precious few. September, November, and these few precious days I'll spend with you. These precious days I'll spend with you. These precious days I'll spend with you.
If we could hold this meeting out of doors, that would find Daniel Newberry right in his element. He spends as much time as he can studying and photographing birds, dragonflies, plants, and just about anything else from the natural world. He has also run 13 ultramarathons since turning 50. Of interest to this demographic, right? Daniel started his career indoors as a software engineer, mostly with the Lotus Development Corporation in Cambridge, Mass., where he helped write parts of several releases of Lotus 1, 2, 3. He assures me you'll know what that is. Staring at computer screens wasn't cutting it, though, so he got a master's degree in forestry and environmental studies, then moved to Oregon to work in watershed management with the Mount Hood National Forest. Since returning from a 2-year break, his wife and he took to teach English in Ecuador. Mr. Newberry has worked as a tribal hydrologist, then executive director of the Applegate River Watershed Council, the Siskiyou Field Institute in Turn, and now the Johnson Creek Watershed Council in Portland. Fish passage is an important issue in Oregon, and Daniel can give us some insights into just how complex that issue can be, especially in an urban setting. A warm hand, please, for Daniel Newberry.
Okay, so fish passage in the urban jungle. There are a lot of really interesting and challenging issues involved in getting fish through urban streams, many of which we don't have in wilderness areas, as you could probably guess, and that is going to be the topic of my talk today. Got it. So I guess the first question is, why do we care about fish passage? And let me first define what I mean by fish passage. And as we know, salmon and other anadromous fish, and let me define that term. Anadromous simply means fish that spend part of their life in the ocean and part of their life in the fresh water. So they've got to be able to get from the ocean all the way up to their natal streams, some of which are in urban areas. So they need access to that habitat for the fish to spawn when they reproduce, and also for the juvenile fish to rear in some of these streams. So you got to ask yourself first, what blocks access? Well, the first thing I think we're all aware of are large hydropower dams, and I chose this as photo. Some of you may recognize this particular photo. This is the Bonneville Dam, not too far upstream from Portland. And as you can see, it's a pretty tall dam. There's not really any fish in the world that could jump over that. Of course, the big dams all have fish ladders that sometimes can cost tens of millions of dollars to construct. But even fish ladders present, I guess, a little bit of difficulty for fish. And I want you to hold that thought, because every little piece of difficulty for a fish adds up over time. So it's not just necessarily one dam. So the second thing, and you find a lot more of these, are small irrigation dams, such as the one here that I'm standing in front of in the photo, which ends up being about 5 feet tall, but that's also very difficult for fish to try to navigate. The third thing is culverts, and culverts are going to be what I talk about mostly in today's discussion. Let's see if I can try this laser pointer. So here's the fish. I know it blends in pretty well, being kind of gray. So let's talk a little bit about culverts. How really does a culvert block fish passage? So the first thing is the jump height. As you can see from this photo, maybe a couple to 3 feet from the pool down below into the culvert. And it's going to be very difficult for some fish. Not impossible, but I think the important thing to remember here is that when it comes to looking at fish passage, we're concerned not only about the barriers that are total barriers, but also barriers that are partial barriers. And when I say partial barrier, something like this is going to be considered a partial barrier, because an adult fish, if there's a pool below the culvert, which there is, can kind of take a running start, or I guess a swimming start, and jump in, but that takes a lot of energy. And sometimes it might not judge it, and it might bang its head on that nice sharp edge of the culvert, and maybe some pathogens can get into the cut, and that's going to make it harder and harder. And it's really this cumulative impact over time of maybe dozens, or in some cases 100 culverts in some cities from the ocean to get to its natal spawning ground. Now, let me just mention to you that the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, or NOAA for short, which I think most people think of NOAA as the organization that gives you your weather reports and tracks cyclones and things like that, but they also deal with anadromous fish and regulating things like fish passage. So that when we want to go to replace a culvert or build a new put in a new culvert, there's some standards, and one of these standards has to do with the jump height. In other words, they consider a culvert out of compliance if it has a jump of over a foot, 1 foot for adult fish, or 6 inches for juvenile fish. I mean, you think of, the younger salmonids, and 6 inches is a lot for a fish that big to jump. So the second part is a steep slope. Now, this is kind of tough to see, but this is looking down a culvert, and you can see this is really fast-moving water. And if you think about it, if you're a fish and you're trying to swim upstream through something like that, that's going to be really difficult. And the longer the culvert, the more difficult it is. In fact, NOAA's standards for a slope has to do with how fast the water can be moving through the culvert. And for a very short culvert, they will allow up to 6 feet per second. But in really long culverts, it has to be 2 feet per second. Because if you think about it, if you're a fish and you're going through a 200, 300-foot culvert, you're going to get tired pretty fast, and you're just going to get washed back down because it's too difficult. So the other thing has to do with the shallow depth. And I want to point out that this particular fish passage, and this is actually this is in Multnomah County over in Gresham. And if it's totally flat like that in the bottom, the water spreads out, and it's really very difficult, especially if you're adult fish, to try to swim through something that tall. I've actually seen some salmon, or actually steelhead, do this incredibly athletic thing where they go on their sides and on some pretty shallow water. But once again, it's using up its energy, because once they leave the ocean and go toward the spawning grounds, they're not eating anymore. So they only have so much energy to use to get to the area where they're going to spawn. So there are an awful lot of culverts, and my organization, the Johnson Creek Watershed Council, and for those of you who may have heard of Johnson Creek but may not know exactly where it is, it starts down at Milwaukee Riverfront Park. It moves a little bit through Milwaukee, passes through southeast Portland, through Gresham, up through parts of Damascus and Boring, and those are where the headwaters are. So it's a 26-mile long stream. And my organization, the Johnson Creek Watershed Council, we did an assessment of all the culverts in the watershed in 2013 and 2014. And we first identified about 325 different culverts or road crossings in the watershed, but when we did our assessment, we only looked at 274 of them. A lot of them in lower Portland we didn't, because some of them are just these huge barriers. We knew we weren't ever going to be able to do anything with them. I mean, huge culverts. But we focused a lot on the upper part of the watershed, middle watershed, and we found that 75% of those culverts that we assessed, 274 of them, in some way or another were barriers to fish. It doesn't mean they were complete barriers, but they were at least partial barriers. And it's a lot of work. We had some assistance from some PSU and some high school students who love to get the experience doing that kind of thing. So here's this is the boundary of Johnson Creek. This is Milwaukee down here. Portland starts right here. It goes through the Sellwood neighborhood and comes all the way up through here. These little perennial streams here are coming off of Powell Butte. And then up in here you have Damascus and parts of Boring up in here. Now it's kind of interesting to note, where are all the streams here? Anybody have any idea where all the streams are?
Underground?
Yeah, they don't exist anymore. When Portland was developed, a lot of the streams, and this happens in a lot of urban areas, they basically pave it over, put them in pipes, and the streams no longer exist. And so really north of Johnson Creek, this part of Portland, and up in here, parts of Gresham, there really aren't any more streams, unfortunately. Now, these little circles are represent all the different culverts and road crossings that we looked at. I mean, there are a lot of them. And there are some places where in 1 mile of stream you might find 20 different culverts. So if you want to try to do something, one of the things you run into really early on is money. What do you do? I mean, 75% of 274 culverts, there's not going to be enough money. There's so many other things in our society competing for money. What are you going to do? And this is what we faced early on. So this is not something that we tackled for the first time. Professionals in our field have been looking at this for decades. So the first thing that people kind of think about is, well, I think this one is a bad one. Let's work and let's fix this one, or let's look at that one. So professional judgment. Another thing that's used quite a bit is, let's look at the number of miles of habitat that we open. So in other words, every culvert, once you get rid of it, you're going to open up above the culvert miles of new habitat that the fish couldn't access before. So that's also used. Another thing is, people say, well, let's do the cheapest projects first. Let's do the most projects with the money we have. Another thing people often look at is, well, let's start with the downstream-most culvert, because it doesn't make sense in some cases to fix and open up all the passage upstream if you have something right at the mouth of the stream that's going to block the fish. That's not really going to help right away until you get that downstream culvert fixed. So some schemes will use like weighted average. They'll say, well, we'll say 25% of it has to do with the downstream culvert and maybe 25% of the cost and 25% whatever. So that's often used. So let's take a look at what we used. We used a model, the acronym is APASS. It stands for Anadromous Passage. And it was initially done by some mathematicians, statisticians in England. And they came up with this linear programming model, which they built a network of you build a network of the whole stream system, and you look at a lot of these factors, like how much habitat each barrier is blocking, and access downstream habitat, downstream culverts, and also cost. And it uses this fancy mathematical formulation to try to come up with basically a ranked list of all the culverts that you're looking at, so that you can start at the top of your list. And the one at the top of the list is not necessarily going to be the least expensive, and it's also not necessarily going to be the one that opens up the most habitat. It's going to be a one where you consider all those factors together. Oh, let me just go back. This last thing, I want to note that passage can be addressed not necessarily by replacing every culvert, because some culverts you can fix them, or at least fix the passage problem. In some cases, it'd be great if you could remove them completely, but that often doesn't work too well in a city, because the reason you have a culvert's a road, and if you kind of removed the culvert and the road, people aren't going to be able to drive through. So that's not often something that we can do in a city. So what we did is we chose 18 culverts as the ones we were going to focus on. And I say 10-year because in 2015, my organization did a basin-wide action plan. So we kind of laid out strategically all the projects we were going to do in the next 10 years. Not only just fish passage, but other things like areas that we wanted to plant trees to create shade to keep the stream cool, looking at some stormwater projects, and just we came up with a strategic plan and action plan for 10 years. That was 2015, so I guess we're 3 years into it now. And these pictures here are just of a couple of those couple culverts that we're looking at. So the first one we did was in 2016, and I want to point out these arrows show the same building to give you a sense of scale. And so this was an overflow culvert. There are actually two culverts here that were totally blocked. We came in with some heavy equipment. We took this out, and we replaced it with a very large culvert. And I like this picture for a number of reasons. Number one, of course, is you can see really see the difference before and after. But if you look here, you're not seeing like a round culvert, are you? You're kind of seeing the top of a circle. And what we did here was, this is actually a 10-foot in diameter culvert that the culvert sunk 4 feet below the surface, or 5 feet. And then we've actually filled it in with stream gravel. And so, for all intents and purposes, is if you're a fish, you're not seeing a culvert, because the stream, it acts like it's a stream channel. You know, you're not going to get that constriction and fast-moving flow because you don't see the bottom of the culvert. And this is a technique that's used, has been used for about 20 years all over the country, and it's just a way of getting rid of that problem with the slope and getting rid of the jump height and those other things that I was talking about earlier. So this is under the Springwater Trail, right near the county line. This is just in Clackamas County. And we did another project last year, interestingly. Yeah, that's a good point. Road crossings, culverts, these are both under the Springwater Trail, which I'm sure everyone here has probably walked or biked on the Springwater Trail at some point. I think a lot of people don't know that the Springwater Trail goes out to Boring. It goes way out there. And you can see, you can't really see the culvert too well in this particular picture. It's right here, but you can see how the water is just coming out really, really fast. And what happens a lot with culverts is that this flow of a stream is constricted. So all that water just speeds up as it goes through the culvert. So here is another, this is taken from across the road. That's the Springwater Trail in the background. You see the culvert here, and then this is what it looks like now. Same idea, although this particular one is not a full culvert. This is 12 feet wide, but this is called a bottomless arch culvert. So this doesn't have a bottom to it. Instead, you have it put on some foundations, and it's an archway over here. And this was right before we repaved it. I promise you we did repave the Springwater Trail when we were done. The City of Portland would not let us get away with not doing that. Because believe it or not, the City of Portland manages the Springwater Trail even in Gresham and even in Boring, because it's owned by the City of Portland. So these are the first two projects that we've done. We have a couple of other projects that we're doing this summer. We're retrofitting this culvert under 262nd Street, and we're putting in baffles. I find this really interesting, but this is a brand new technology called New Zealand baffles. And here are the baffles. They're pieces of plastic that are bolted to the bottom of the culvert that under low flow they stand up so that they pool water behind them, so that as fish move up when there's really low flow, they can like rest a while behind the baffle. But during high flow, they lay down. They're not totally rigid. They lay right down. And then they have the memory, because they're so rigid, that when the flow goes back down, they pop back up again. And it's a technology been used in New Zealand for about 5 years. We are being a pilot site. This is the first time it's being used in the Northwest, or in this part of, in the Northwest. And there's also another pilot going on at Hood River at the same time. So we're both going to be putting those in this month. So the second one, this is under Highway 26. This is also on the North Fork of Johnson Creek. And this is a retrofit. We're putting in a different kind of baffle here, but we're also adding larger rock material to the base to bring the level of the creek up to the culvert, since trying to replace a culvert under Highway 26 would cost millions of dollars. So this is a way of doing a retrofit so that fish can get through, but we won't try to spend millions on it. Now, both of these are under the North Fork. There was one under the North Fork Johnson Creek last year. This is at the bottom of that Highway 26 culvert. There's a jump height here. I wanted to put this up because this is the North Fork of Johnson Creek. This milky looking area is its watershed. And as you can see, there's 7 culverts on here. Here's the downstream one that we fixed last summer. These are the 2 we're doing this summer. In 2016, the East Multnomah Soil and Water Conservation District fixed these. They took out one and replaced 2 of them on their farm. And what we're doing here is we're trying to fix fish passage in an entire watershed. Even with that model that we used, we realized later on, as we looked at some of the modeling that's going on for climate change, that urban streams in Johnson Creek in particular are going to be very difficult to host salmon as the temperature goes up, unless we can really get fish to the coldest water in the watershed. And the North Fork of Johnson Creek, partly because there's so many springs feeding it, is one of the coldest sources of water in our watershed. So what we decided was we got together a coalition of all the different agencies and landowners who manage these culverts, and we said, let's take them all out together within a few years. Let's or replace them or retrofit them, because we'll be able to attract more funding at a national level if we're doing a bigger project where we get all these groups together working together. So next summer, the last two of these are going to be going out, and fish will be able to use this entire watershed. And interestingly enough, one of the ways we're monitoring this is with a new technology called environmental DNA, or eDNA. And what you do is you take some samples and you analyze it against reference samples for different species of fish, so you can actually tell if those species of fish are using that stream, because there'll be DNA from like old fish scales or feces of fish. And we did this last fall. Up here, we did not find any, but that's because we're not expecting it, because the fish can't get up there now. So we're going to keep doing it every year for a few years and see if that changes. So we're taking this approach of looking at cooler tributaries. There's another system, Kelly Creek, Mitchell Creek, and for those of you who know this part of the watershed, if you go down Foster Road, once you get to about 160th, 170th, 180th in there, you have Kelly Creek flowing through there. Mitchell Creek is a tributary, and we have two projects that we're doing next summer. One of them is, here's this big pond. It's 7/10 of an acre, and the pond was created when a previous landowner dammed it up. He just put in two culverts, in this case, because he wanted to create a racetrack for ATVs and horses over the stream, and he created this oval track. Well, of course, that totally blocked fish passage in here, unfortunately. But property's now owned by the Centennial School District, and they have given us permission to go in and do a restoration project and pull that out. One of the things about inline ponds, we call them inline because they block up the stream, so they're right in the line of the stream. They really heat up the water. Especially this pond in the summer is only 10 inches deep. We've been monitoring this for years, and we found that on a really hot day last summer, the temperature was increased above and below the pond by 14 degrees Celsius. Like 20 degrees Fahrenheit, or it was horrible. So anyway, next summer we're taking that out. And you can see, here's the downstream culvert that they put in, and water is basically not even flowing because the water level is below the culvert. I mean, there's a trickle going underneath it, but really bad problem. Here's this photo I did again. We're taking out this dam on Kelly Creek, which is actually below the other one I showed you, so that we're taking out all the complete fish passage barriers, both of them, so fish will be able to get up the system. And interestingly enough, the landowner that he diverted this so he could fulfill his water right, get irrigation. This is what it looks like behind his dam, and of course this is also an inline pond, maybe not as big as the other, but this is also heating up the streams. So let's look ahead a little bit to the future. What does the future hold? Well, we're going to continue to address the high priority barriers, and we've already got several of them identified. We're talking to landowners. One of the things that you find in this business is it takes many, many years to get one of these projects done. I mean, first of all, you have to convince whoever owns the barrier to allow you to do a project. And there are many ways of doing a project, and in fact, this last one that I mentioned with the landowner with the irrigation dam, he still needs to be able to use his water right. So one of the things that we're going to be doing is we're buying him a pump, and we're creating a little basin downstream in Kelly Creek where he can put his pump in during the irrigation season and pull water out so he can still irrigate. So, there are a lot of different ways of doing things, but one of the things in my business that you find when you're working with private landowners to do projects on their land, it just takes time to build trust and for people to really be comfortable with what you're trying to do. I mean, we've been talking with this landowner for several years, and he was initially kind of skeptical, but now he's very enthusiastic. I think it just, over time, it just takes a while. So, as you saw earlier, we're planning on planning for climate change by emphasizing fish passage work on cold water tributaries. And once we get these tributaries opened up, we have some plans for enhancing habitat, like putting large wood into the streams to have places for the fish, especially juvenile fish, to hold and to rear. And I wanted to end up with something that's not technical from my point of view, but technical from a legal point of view, which I thought you'd be interested in. There's a court case that involves culverts and tribes. So it's called Washington versus the United States. That's not Washington, D.C., that's the state of Washington against the United States, although sometimes it does seem like Washington, D.C. is against the United States. So what this case is all about is it says whether a treaty with a tribe, quote, whether the right of taking fish at all its usual and accustomed grounds and stations in common with all citizens guarantees that the number of fish would always be sufficient to provide a moderate living to the tribes. And this language is taken out of a treaty from the 19th century. Both Oregon and California had treaties with quite a few tribes, and part of the treaties guaranteed fishing access so that they could at least, at a minimum, do sustenance, thank you, sustenance fishing. So here's the question, one of the big questions in the case. Does an impassable culvert block a tribe's access to their usual and accustomed fishing rights? Well, this is a case that's been kicking around through the court system, working its way up from lower courts to higher courts, really for decades. This has been going on. And the lower federal courts sided with the tribes on this. They said it does block passage. I mean, really, after the treaty was signed, these culverts were then put in, and it blocked access. And in some cases, the tribe would have to prove that somewhere on those rivers in the affected watersheds that historically their ancestors actually had been fishing there. Because it's not true everywhere, but in some cases it was true. But here's the interesting thing. This course came to the Supreme Court, and it was decided by not deciding. Okay, so in other words, one of the things that happens in the court system is if a court deadlocks, they've made no decision, but they have considered it. So they go back to the next lower court, and whatever decision that lower court made stands, and the case is decided. So in this case, the Supreme Court tied 4-4, and you can guess along which lines the different justices decided, because that's the way it goes in the Supreme Court these days. The lower court, it rules. The ruling rules.
What year?
June of 2018 was when the Supreme Court decided it. This just got decided recently. But this case has been kicking around for so long that Justice Anthony Kennedy, who's been in the news recently because he's going to be retiring soon, he had to recuse himself. And the reason well, first of all, does everyone remember how long Justice Kennedy's been on the court? Or which president appointed him? Reagan. Ronald Reagan appointed him. So that was a while ago. And it turns out that he was involved in this case when he was on a lower court. So this has been going on for a long time. So because of that, he had to recuse himself from making a decision. Now, what does this mean for Oregon? Well, first of all, this was a case brought by Washington tribes. So it doesn't right now affect Oregon. And what's interesting is, Joyce mentioned in my bio that I was at one point a tribal hydrologist. It was a tribe in Northern California, and the tribes there did not have treaties with the United States government, unlike Oregon and Washington. And that's one of the reasons that you really don't find reservations in California, or very few reservations, and they're very, very small. And many of them, the tribes live on what are called rancherias, which are not really reservations. But in Oregon and Washington, there were some bigger tribes, and they have treaties. So we have treaties here. So I'm going to guess that based on that case, that there are probably going to be some Oregon tribes that are going to file suit along the same grounds.
Any issue with beaver or other water mammals?
In Johnson Creek, or just in general? Or? So this is a plant. I asked him to ask this question. So our Watershed Council for the last 3 years has had a big community science program where we train volunteers to go out and do beaver surveys in Johnson Creek and its tributaries. And we have found, I think they're going on right now. In fact, this weekend they're going on. But last year, I think we found 45 beaver dams in the watershed. If any of you are really interested, the biggest beaver dam in Johnson Creek is on Errol Creek, down near the intersection of Johnson Creek Boulevard and 45th, at the bottom of Errol Heights Park. Huge, huge beaver dam. But there are quite a few. And what's really interesting is that there have been studies looking at beaver dams and say, do beaver dams, in fact, block fish passage? Do beaver dams create stream temperature rise? And this is a really interesting question. It looks like for most small beaver dams, neither one of those are an issue because they are somewhat porous in the way they build it. Fish can actually swim through the interstitial areas in the dam to get up in a lot of cases, especially juveniles. And what happens too is that when water is dammed up, like some of these irrigation dams or even beaver dams, one of the things you find temperature-wise is the temperature stratifies. In other words, you tend to get hot water right near the surface where the solar radiation comes in, but that effect doesn't go all the way down to the bottom. But what happens in most irrigation dams is the water is spilling out over the top. So you get that hot water spilling out over the top, but you get a pool of fairly cold water at the bottom. And what happens in beaver dams is because they're so porous, you get cold water coming out at the bottom, and that hot water continues to stratify and almost acts like a little heat shield at the top, and the cold water comes through. If you all are interested in this topic, let me put in a plug for an event that we're doing next month, October 16th, Tuesday, 1 to 5 p.m. at Reed College. We're doing our 4th annual Johnson Creek Science Symposium, and we have people from academia, different practitioners from different government levels, our Watershed Council. It's going to be from 1 to 5. There are going to be talks based on new scientific findings and projects going on in the last year. And there are two talks that actually look at beaver dams and temperature out of the 12 presentations that we'll have. So thank you.
Do you deal with pollution at all? And I mean, is this a problem? Are these fish safe to eat?
You know, I would not eat urban fish because of what you just mentioned. That is resident fish. Now, when it comes to salmon, they spend most of their life in the ocean, and they're just swimming upstream to spawn, so they will not have had that much time for the pollutants to be absorbed into their tissue. But I would say around here, I wouldn't want to eat the salmon in Johnson Creek because there are not a whole lot. And I'm a vegetarian, but that's... you know, we've been documenting fish in salmon and steelhead in Johnson Creek, and Johnson Creek is really the only, free-flowing tributary to the Willamette right in this area in Portland that has salmon in it. Yeah.
Yeah, speaking about the difference between urban and non-urban fish, urban, of course, you have lots of people, and I can think of 4 things that might impact the fish that come along with the people, and that would be cats, rats, possums, and coyotes. No, not possums, raccoons and coyotes. That all those things seem to follow the people and live in the cities, and they might also like bothering the fish. I could imagine a raccoon sitting in the end of that pipe waiting for a fish to just jump up there and grabbing them. Do you have any idea about what other things we're going to have to mitigate besides these culverts to make these fish populations healthy in the city?
Okay, well, thank you for asking that question. We did a 5-year water quality study published it in 2015, and it turns out that most of the major pollutants that we're seeing in Johnson Creek are related to automobiles. You find this in most cities. What happens is, just coming off of roads and parking lots when it rains, you get heavy metals, zinc and copper in particular, which are related to brake pads. You have copper in your brake pads, and you get little bits, but that all adds up over time. You get polyaromatic hydrocarbons, which come from the different kinds of fuels. You know, when you have an oil leak or an antifreeze leak, and it settles out and dries on the asphalt, and that eventually gets into the streams. So those are the main pollutants in Johnson Creek. But believe it or not, the other big major pollutant is DDT. And you might say, well, DDT was banned in 1971, 72. But it's a type of pesticide that doesn't decompose in the soil. And there have been a lot of agricultural land in this entire region, and every time the soil erodes, which it does a lot because we're developing so fast, and every time you build a house or a shopping mall on an area that used to be just bare soil, especially agriculture, you're going to get erosion. It gets into the stream, so DDT is definitely still a big problem. But we are also starting to do some projects working with industrial landowners on their parking lots to take out parts of their parking lot and put planters in there to encourage water to infiltrate on site so that the soil can mitigate some of those pollutants instead of having water in the parking lots go into drains, storm drains that go right into the creek. So we're doing a little bit of that, but that's really, I think, the next frontier for urban restoration, is to try to encourage water to infiltrate into the soil on site so that it doesn't go into the storm drains. And that's also a flooding problem too, because the more water that goes directly into the pipes and into the streams, it goes a lot faster. So what we're seeing, and this has been seen for decades in cities all over the world, is that the more you pave over an area, the more that watershed experiences flooding.
Do you have trouble getting volunteers, and if so, in what areas?
Okay.
I mean, what jobs?
Well, we do not have trouble getting volunteers, which is a wonderful thing to have. Last weekend, we did our annual stream cleanup. We had 250 volunteers turn out walking through Johnson Creek. We're still getting the final totals from Metro, which is they donated their tipping fee at the transfer station, but it's close to 6 tons of garbage, which is the same amount we pulled out last year. And this is kind of interesting. It's kind of a sad take on our society, but for a while we thought that we were getting rid of all the legacy trash, the trash accumulated for decades, and for several years it was going down, and we were getting about 3 tons of trash, and then it started going up a couple years ago. And the reason is because there's so many camps right along Johnson Creek, and the garbage increases with the camps. So the garbage, unfortunately, has gone back up, But the nice thing is the last 2 years we've had record turnouts and volunteers. So people really, really want to keep fish in Johnson Creek. They want their home stream to be a lot cleaner, and it's really great. We also do a lot of volunteer work. I mentioned community science. We have about 250 people who do everything from monitoring migratory dragonflies to salmon sightings to beaver activity. And we also have volunteers that do tree planting in the winter, mostly along Johnson Creek. Last year we set a record. We had just shy of 2,400 volunteer signups in 1 year. So people really love, in Portland, they really love their local parks and their local streams.
Yeah, two questions. First, do you have an idea on what the historic numbers of adult salmon that would return kind of pre?
In Johnson Creek, no, I don't think, before about 20 years ago, nobody was really looking too much at the numbers. I mean, certainly we have anecdotal information from people who, grew up in Johnson Creek in the 50s. It's kind of interesting that the real problems started in the 1960s in terms of the salmon runs crashing. There's a lot of industry going on, new industry starting in Johnson Creek, a lot of development. The development's continued. I've talked to some folks who, used to talk about fishing in Johnson Creek and how many salmon there were. Interestingly enough, if I can put in another plug, we just moved our office location and we're having a big office warming, welcome, open house party on September 21st. Our office is in the All Saints Episcopal Church, Southeast 41st in Woodstock, and the man whose family gave the land for Tideman Johnson Park is going to be giving a slideshow at our open house showing decades worth of photos at that park, what is now the park. But long way of saying yes, there used to be a lot of fish in Johnson, a lot of salmon in Johnson Creek, but right around the 1960s that number really crashed.
Oh, yeah. The other, just if you could speak to how all these projects are being paid for, if they're out of your budget, if you have public funding or Metro or ODOT, or how that works.
Well, our budget is supplemented. I mean, our budget, we get about, I'd say about 65-70% of our budget comes from grants or contracts, a lot of them public sector. So for instance, some of our major funders are Metro, East Multnomah Soil and Water Conservation District, Oregon Watershed Enhancement Board, some from the city of Portland, not a lot, but some. So we do get a lot of public funds.
Thank you for the work that you're doing. I appreciate it. Carp is a worldwide problem. Do we seem to have a problem with it? Carp.
In some streams in the metro region, yes. However, what's really, really interesting, of all the problems that Johnson Creek has as an urban stream, invasive species is not one of them. For some reason, almost all the fish, native or resident or anadromous in Johnson Creek are native fish, which is pretty cool that we don't have that problem to deal with as well.
Again, thank you for your work. And I have 3 questions. The first one is, migratory dragonflies? What? Can you tell us about migratory dragonflies?
I'd be glad to, since I love dragonflies. Okay, so...
well, okay, and then the second and third are, for cooling, are there plans about planting trees along the stream? And finally, how long will it take for salmon to repopulate streams that they haven't been in?
Okay. So, dragonflies. There are 5 known species of migratory dragonflies in the United States. 3 of them spend part of their year in the Johnson Creek watershed. For those of you who are interested, those 3 are common green darner, variegated meadowhawk, and black saddlebags. There is an indication that, scientifically, that when these dragonflies are migrating, they're going to stop as they're migrating to the area where they're going to lay their eggs and mate in wetland areas that are of the highest quality. They're going to seek wetlands of the higher quality. So one of the ways we're able to tell which wetlands in our watershed have the better quality is to look to see which dragonflies are using them. So we've been working with, this is our third summer, and we're looking at 3 sites. One of them, for those of you who know Selwood, is Westmoreland Park, since there's a really high diversity of dragonflies using Westmoreland Park. One is another one called Brookside Park, which is near the Foster floodplain on Foster Road southeast, about 112th, 113th, somewhere out there. And the third one is this location that I showed in my presentation, the pond owned by the Centennial School District. Since we're doing a rather large restoration project there, we have 2 years of pre-project data, dragonflies, and we're going to look at it afterwards. So we're going to see what the difference is in the overall biodiversity of dragonflies and damselflies. We're not just looking at the 3 migratory. We're basically inventorying everything we see there, and we're going to.
Where do they migrate?
Well, the common green darner in particular, it can migrate 2,500 miles, from Mexico. A lot of them land here. I mean, we're kind of their summer location. Trees. So our watershed council was founded in 1995. We've been planting trees along Johnson Creek every year since then. So a lot of that work being done. But as you know, it takes time for trees to grow up enough to provide shade. And the third question was?
Repopulation.
So there's definitely some evidence that it can happen as soon as the barrier is removed. Lack of habitat is a big issue. Salmon they have some mechanism that we don't fully understand, whether it's the Earth's magnetic field or sense of smell or a combination of both, or looking at the stars, of how to find out. No, I'm serious about the stars. Where the stars are in the sky, the time where they can find how to get back to their natal streams. But that being the case, there's a lack of habitat. And so salmon will sometimes, if they sense newer habitat, they'll keep swimming. Because for certain species, let's say steelhead, they'll want to travel as far upstream as possible. So you take away the barrier and they'll go up. So that can happen right away. It all depends on the size of the run. I mean, if you don't have a lot of them to begin with, they may miss that newly opened area.
You were talking about doing this restoration out in Boring, and I'm wondering, does the path clear from Boring down to the Willamette on Johnson? In other words, all the barriers are removed and the water's been cooled by tree planting or whatever, so fish can get that far?
At this point, salmon should be able to get up all the way up on the main stem of Johnson Creek, all the way up to maybe not downtown Boring, since that's actually outside the watershed, but in that part of the watershed they can get up on the main stem. At this point, most of the work we're doing is on the tributaries. Just in general, certain types of anadromous fish, or most of them actually, will prefer to spawn on tributaries rather than on large main stem. And part of that has to do with just because, let's take coho salmon as an example. So in our area, coho salmon will tend to spawn in tributaries from October to December. Now, especially once you get down to December, you can get really big rainstorms, which lead to really big floods, which lead to really high velocities. And when salmon reproduce, they reproduce by laying their eggs in a little nest called a redd, R-E-D-D. And if the flow velocity is too great, it can get washed right out. And then they don't their eggs don't turn into fish. So coho salmon like to spawn in off-channel habitats, little sloughs off the main channel. And you find that with some other species too. Depending on when their eggs are in the nests, in the redds, they don't want it to be there if their redds can get washed out by high flooding or high velocity floods. Yeah.
Are you a private entity, the Johnson Creek Council? Is it a private group of citizens?
We are a nonprofit organization.
Nonprofit organization.
And we survive on donations.
Okay.
Just kidding.
And
Yeah.
are there other organizations like that? There's a project, we live near Tryon Creek, and I know they're planning to build a culvert over Boone's Ferry Road that will help with salmon migration. Would that be another tribute, like another group that would be doing something like that?
Well, I'm familiar with the project. So Tryon Creek in particular has an impassable fish barrier right at the mouth. So salmon really can't use Tryon Creek. But the city of Portland has actually got some funding now. They've been working, get some federal funding. It's quite an expensive project.
Yeah.
To open up, get rid of the culvert now that's blocking passage, and which is pretty exciting because there's a lot of good habitat upstream in Tryon Creek. So in this case, it's the city of Portland that's going to be doing that project, the Bureau of Environmental Services.
Okay.
But there is a Tryon Creek Watershed Council as well. And they do a lot of tree planting work with volunteers. So
So that would be it.
yeah, there are probably about 80 watershed councils throughout Oregon.
Oregon, okay.
Ours is one of the larger ones, but there are about 80.
And if the salmon can't get any farther, is that where they spawn? They go as far as they can go?
Typically, that happens. It's kind of a sad sight, but there are definitely plenty of places where there's a huge dam that blocks a lot of great habitat. And what happens sometimes is the fish will try to spawn right at the base of the dam, and there'll be so many fish that they'll actually wreck each other's redds trying to spawn. I found this out when I was working on the Applegate River. There's a huge dam that blocks access to the upper Applegate watershed, and we found that fish were just spawning on top of each other. Yeah.
Are there any other fish besides salmon that are anagrams?
Yeah, absolutely. Steelhead is salmonid. Yeah, so non-salmonid anadromous fish. Yes, Pacific lamprey. Lamprey, Lamprey. Some people think of them as eels, but they're actually fish. They're some of the oldest fish, species-wise or genus-wise, in the world. They date back to dinosaur era. They look like eels, but if you look at them up close, they actually have, the dorsal fins and the anal fins, just like fish. They also have pretty substantial teeth. Ever seen them? Yeah. And we have those in Johnson Creek as well. Those are the only ones that I'm aware of are the salmonids, which include steelhead and Pacific lamprey. They're also resident lamprey. Johnson Creek, we have brook lamprey. And what's interesting is lamprey have a special significance to a lot of Northwest tribes. They were a food source. They're important. And they've been declining in the last few decades, like salmon. There's a lot of research going on right now about how do you do restoration that will benefit lamprey, and there's just not a lot of information about some of their life cycle and also where they are. Lamprey, when they're juveniles, they burrow into the mud, maybe about this long, and they just live in the mud for a long time, so it's hard to count them. There was a project done on Johnson Creek a few years ago near Luther Road, right around equivalent of 75th Avenue going out, and they dewatered part of Johnson Creek to do the watershed, and the whole bank was just shimmering. There's all these juvenile lamprey. They're coming out as they sensed that the bank was drying out and they wanted to find something else. So they're there, and when we did this culvert replacement project in Boring 2 years ago, we pulled out the culvert. I was there, supervising the contractors, and I saw this fish swimming in the mud right underneath the culvert. It turned out it was a Pacific lamprey that was this big. So they find places to live.
The asking the question before about the competition in spawning grounds, is there any introduction of infant coho and steelheads into the Johnson Stream to encourage,
Yeah,
or is there no need for that?
Well, there hasn't been any, introduction. This has happened on a lot of streams where they're trying to reintroduce the Johnson Creek. At this point, it's expensive, and I think that because urban salmon runs tend to be smaller than non-urban, that the focus has been to try to increase the salmon runs as much as possible. So you start off with maybe something like the Umpqua River or someplace like that where there's a lot more habitat.
Part of my question was answered, that if the salmon can't get through the barriers, they will spawn anyway somewhere. But if they're unimpeded, do they go really accurately to the exact place they came from?
That's what the science shows.
Wow.
Pretty close.
How do they know?
Well, what's interesting is, I mentioned earlier that some of the current theories have to do with the Earth's magnetic field and being very sensitive to that, or possibly a sense of smell. There's been research in the last decade that has shown that certain types of pesticide interfere with a salmon's sense of smell, and that is one of the many reasons why salmon have been declining, because they can't figure out how to get back to their natal grounds.
I'm from Michigan, and
No anadromous fish there.
I understand, but was, and I assume still, a real problem with the lamprey. They spent millions killing as many lampreys as they could because it destroyed the native fish. So I'm surprised that you are encouraging lamprey, but apparently here they're not the problem that they were in the Great Lakes.
Well, remember that for every invasive species you have, it used to be native to somewhere. And it's not a problem in its somewhere. It's only a problem typically in the areas where it's introduced. Whether that be Himalayan blackberry or lamprey.
So what you're saying is that it was introduced to the lakes, and then
I'm guessing
that's why it's a problem.
I'm guessing it was.
It's the St. Lawrence Seaway. When they opened the St. Lawrence Seaway, then the lamprey could get into the Great Lakes, and previously they couldn't.
Right.
Well, I
So
think
that's why it became such a problem.
Okay.
I think some people were using them as bait, and then when they got loose, then they began to multiply like crazy. And I don't know if you're familiar with the problem or not. Maybe
I'm
you
not.
are. No. Well, they did all kinds of things in the streams to try to destroy the lamprey. So, and anyway, I'm surprised that that they're trying to bring them back.
You were saying they always return to where they came from. So
They
when
would prefer.
when a new creek opens up, because of your modifying the culverts, how do they return to a stream they've never been to?
Because in a lot of cases, they can sense that a habitat will actually be preferable. So while they try to return to where the egg was laid, if they can keep swimming upstream because they know there's better habitat or they sense there's better habitat, they will try to do that. Especially that example of the dam where fish are spawning on top of each other. That's, even though they might have been born there, it might not be ideal and they might want to keep going.
Shifting streams, I understand that we're renegotiating the Columbia River Treaty with Canada, and they'd like to have salmon back, which they haven't had since Grand Coulee went in. Do you know anything about the issues there about reestablishing salmon runs above Grand Coulee?
I was not aware that was talk on the table about trying to get, that's going to be difficult. The only way, you could really do that, because the Grand Coulee Dam's not going to come out. But, I suppose they might spend $500 million on a fish ladder or something. I don't know. what's interesting, there are certain places where the Army Corps of Engineers actually has a program where they actually catch the fish at dams and they truck them up around the dam. It's crazy, but I don't know, maybe they're going to do something like that at the Grand Coulee Dam. I don't know. Thank you.